Whatever he knows, whatever he does, you blame the Marchettis. You're the grieving bride. You don't know anything. That girl lives. The other one doesn't leave this house. I know how to wear a face, I said. I wore one for you for 11 weeks. Empire of Ashes, Episode 13, The Year He Died. Written by Mia. Lena. Greco's house made the Marchetti glass house look like a confession. Where Dario's father had built in steel and glass, everything visible, everything a statement. Look how much I have. Greco's was old stone behind a high wall. A villa that had watched the city be founded and would be there to watch it fall, giving away nothing. You didn't see the wealth. You felt the age. The kind of money that no longer needs to be looked at. A footman took my coat. The good one, the one without a ledger sewn into it. I'd left the war at home tonight, by necessity, and I understood, walking into that hall on my husband's arm, that I was entering the actual seat of power in a city I'd spent 3 years believing I understood, and that I'd come to it as the guest of the man who murdered my father, and that I was going to have to eat his food and drink his wine and smile. We'd spent the drive over not talking about the thing, and talking about it the way people do when they don't. Sophia had dressed me for it, not the armor of old money she'd put me in to rehearse the commission, but something softer. A grieving young wife, deliberately a little out of her depth. Greco distress polish, she'd said, grim, pinning my hair down instead of up. He spent 60 years watching people perform strength at him. So perform weakness. Be the thing he isn't afraid of. In the car, Dario had held my hand too tightly and said nothing useful and everything true with the holding. Once, at a red light, he'd said, if it goes wrong in there, if he moves tonight, you let me be the loud one. You get to the car. Nico's on the wall. And I'd said, it won't go wrong tonight. He wants something. You don't dress a problem for dinner you're planning to drown. And Dario had looked at me with that particular terror that was becoming the native language of our marriage and said, God, you really are good at this. And hadn't quite meant it as a compliment. Whatever he says, Dario murmured at the door. The last thing before the footman opened it. Whatever he knows, whatever he does, you blame the Marchettis. You're the grieving bride. You don't know anything. That girl lives. The other one doesn't leave this house. I know how to wear a face, I said. I wore one for you for 11 weeks. I know. His hand tightened on mine. That's the only reason I think we might survive the soup. Don Vittorio Greco was 80 if he was a day, small and dry and immaculate. And he rose when I came in, a courtesy, old world, the manners of a man who has never once had to be rude, because the world arranges itself around his preferences before he is to voice them. Mrs. Marchetti, he said, and took my hand in both of his dry ones and looked at me with eyes the color of weak tea and absolute attention. Or, do you prefer Russo? At my table, you may be whichever you like. I'm too old to be lied to, and I was too fond of your late father to want his daughter pretending through the soup. And there it was, in the first 10 seconds. The whole game laid on the table, my buried name in his mouth, like a sweet he was rolling around to taste my reaction. Dario went very still beside me. I felt the trappion open. Deny the name, and I'm a liar in the house of a man who despises being lied to. Claim it, and I've admitted I'm exactly the threat he suspects. So, I did the thing my father taught me. The thing Dario didn't know I still had in me. I told a piece of the truth to bury the rest of it. Lena's fine, I said. Russo, Marchetti. I've buried a father under one name and a self under the other. You'll forgive me if I'm not especially attached to either. I let him see a flash of the grief. Real. Because the only lie that survives a man like Greco is one built around something true. You knew my father? I knew Aldo for 20 years. He gestured me to a chair. The table was small, intimate, 3 places. The menace of it was how kind it looked. A brilliant man. Wasted. In the end, on the Marchettis, Salvatore never did know what to do with a genuinely honest accountant except bleed him. A small dry smile at Dario. No offense to your father, my boy. He was a butcher who thought he was a banker. We all loved him. None of us trusted him with anything we couldn't afford to lose. Back to me, and the weak tea eyes warmed a half-degree, which was worse. Your father, though. Your father I trusted, right up until the very end. That was my mistake. And his. The courses came and went, brought by silent men, and Greco talked about the city, about the old families, about a war in the 50s he'd ended with a single dinner not unlike this one. And every word of it was a test. Every anecdote a small door he held open, to see whether I'd walk through it and show him the shape of what I knew. He mentioned the Falcons and watched for my flinch. He mentioned the cannery. I heard there was some unpleasantness on the wharf. Old Falcone tells it rather differently than I'd have expected, and watched to see whether I'd defend my own performance there. He mentioned, lightly over the fish, that Salvatore's books must be in a dreadful state. God rest him. The man couldn't add, and let the sentence hang like bait over still water, an invitation for the clever accountant to correct him. I didn't take a single one. I grieved, and I deflected, and I let myself look half a step slow, the way Sophia had dressed me to look, and I watched the old man's interest sharpen with every door I declined to walk through. Because a woman who shows you nothing is so much more interesting than one who shows you fear. I was playing not clever for a man who'd invited me precisely because I was clever and we both knew it, and the not knowing whether he knew was the entire grammar of the meal. My father had a name for it. The long table. Everyone lying, everyone watching, and the food goes cold while the real eating gets done. Dario. I have sat across tables from men who wanted me dead. It's practically a Tuesday. You learn the grammar of it young in my family, where the hands are, where the doors are, how many breaths you've got. I knew that grammar cold, and at Greco's table it was useless, because Greco doesn't kill you across a table. He kills you 3 weeks later, in a way that looks like weather after you've stopped watching. The danger in that room wasn't in any hand or any door. It was in the old man's attention, which moved over my wife like water finding the cracks in a wall. Patient, certain that, given enough time, it gets in everywhere. And she held. God, she held. I watched Lena Russo sit at the table of her father's murderer and grieve on cue and flirt with the truth and give him a performance so flawless that even I, who'd watched her run the same con on me for 11 weeks, who knew every gear and spring of it, even I half believed I was watching a simple widow be charmed by a kind old man. She was better than my father. She was better than me. And the better she was, the more afraid I got, because I could see the things she couldn't from inside it, that Greco was enjoying her, that he hadn't brought us here to test whether she knew. He'd brought us here because he had already decided she did, and he wanted to see the quality of the mind up close before he made his offer. You do not audition a woman you intend to kill. The only thing worse than Greco wanting Lena dead, I understood somewhere around the second course, was Greco wanting Lena. Because a man can't have a thing he merely wants to kill. A man can have a thing he wants to use. And Greco was the most patient acquirer in the history of the city. He'd waited 30 years to absorb my father's empire, and he'd have waited 30 more if Salvatore hadn't had the courtesy to die. I could watch the new acquisition taking shape behind his weak tea eyes across the candles. Not the corpse of the Marchettis, which he could take any Thursday he liked. Her, the mind. Aldo Russo's daughter, bent to Greco's books, a generational talent he'd nearly thrown in the harbor and was now, in his old age, clever enough to want to keep instead. And I sat there with my hand on my wife's knee under the cloth, performing the proud, untroubled husband, and I did the cold arithmetic my father trained into me. And I arrived, for the first time in my life, at a number I refused to pay. He could have the empire, the name, the births, the warehouses, the whole rotten inheritance. He could not have her. I would burn every brick of it down first. And 11 weeks ago, I had not known there was a single thing on this earth I would ever say that about. Lena. He let me get all the way to dessert before he stopped playing. I'm going to do you the courtesy of being direct, Greco said, setting down his spoon. Because your father would have. And because I find I haven't the patience at my age for the long way around with someone who'll see through it anyway. He folded his dry hands. You found the account, Lena. The 140,000. Don't. He raised one finger, gently, as Dario shifted in his chair. Don't insult the evening. You pulled the thread 4 days ago. I felt it move, the way you feel a spider feel a fly. I have watched for 3 years a Russo daughter wage a clever, patient, completely misdirected little war on the Marchettis, and I confess it entertained me. The way good theater entertains me. But 4 days ago you stopped being theater and started being a problem. And I have a very strict policy about problems, which your father could explain to you, if I hadn't made that impossible. The wine turned to nothing in my mouth. He'd said it. The confession, laid on the table between the candles, casual as the salt cellar. I killed your father. And his weak tea eyes watched me hold my face together over it with what I can only call connoisseurship, the pleasure of a man admiring his own handiwork in real time. But I am 81, Greco went on, and I am tired, and I have a problem of my own that your father's book describes in humiliating detail. And I have come in my old age to prefer using a thing to breaking it. So here is what I'm going to offer you, Lena Russo. One time, tonight. He smiled, and it was almost grandfatherly, and it was the most frightening thing I have ever seen on a human face. Come and work for me. That mind, your father's mind, the very one I wasted by killing the man who carried it, turned to my books instead of against them. Bury my collateral the way you're about to bury Salvatore's. Make an old man's sins disappear. Do that, and the Marchettis live. Your husband keeps his pretty corpse of an empire under my protection, with the commission's blessing. Sophia stays unmarried to anyone dreadful. Nico keeps breathing. And you, the candlelight moved in his eyes. You get the one thing your father wanted so badly, he sold me his soul for it. Everyone you love. Safe. Behind the strongest wall in the city, which is mine. It was, I'll admit it, a beautiful offer. That was the horror of it. That Greco had found the exact shape of the thing I wanted and held it out to me in a murderer's hand. Everyone's safe. The war over. My gift, the one my father had spent his life sharpening, finally turned to protect the people I loved instead of avenge the one I'd lost. It was my father's own last wish, handed back to me inverted. Protection for Elle, protection for everyone in exchange for Elle herself. And all I had to do was the one thing that would have killed my father a second time. Take the gift he made to expose men like Greco and spend it hiding their sins instead. Become the precise opposite of him, while wearing his face. I understood, sitting there over the ruins of desert, that this was the cruelest thing the old man could possibly have devised, and that he devised it on purpose. Because a man like Greco doesn't only want your service. He wants you to hand it over knowing exactly what it costs your soul. A tool that hates itself is the most loyal tool there is. He'd have learned that, I thought, across 30 years of Salvatore. And if I say no, I said. My voice came out steadier than the rest of me had any right to be. Then Thursday, at the commission, I expressed grave concern about the stability of the House of Marchetti. He said it the way you'd order the weather, and the families carve it to the bone before the coffee cools. I've spent 3 days making certain they're hungry for it. And some weeks after that, when the grief of losing her new husband has quite understandably overwhelmed her, the poor Russo girl does what grieving women in this city are so often driven to do, off the end of the wharf. So tragic, that family. Such a run of luck. I'll send flowers to both funerals. He paused. I'm very good at funerals. He let it sit. Then he lifted his glass, and the candlelight came through the wine the color of old blood, and he regarded it with genuine, unhurried pleasure. Do think it over carefully. You have until to sit down. He turned the glass in the light. And you should know, I'd want you to know, your father would want you to know, that this wine is from the year he died. A magnificent vintage. I lay a case down whenever I solve a particularly difficult problem. I've been saving this one for an occasion. He smiled at me over the rim. I rather suspect I'm about to need to open a fresh bottle, one way or the other. To Aldo. He drank, slow, eyes never leaving mine. He'd be so proud of how clever you turned out. He always told me you were the smartest thing he ever made. He was trying to warn me, I think. He needn't have. It's exactly why I want you. And Don Vittorio Greco drank to my dead father, in wine he had bought to celebrate murdering him, and watched me sit very still and decide what kind of daughter I was going to turn out to be. The one who died for a principle, the way Aldo had, or the one who was finally, at long last, smart enough not to. To be continued. That was episode 13 of Empire of Ashes. If this one has its hooks in you, the next episode is already waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The complete book is on Amazon, and early episodes plus Dario POV bonus scenes are on my Patreon. Links are in the description.
Heir mia.
Thank you for listening.